In 1985, the American game market had mostly crashed. It was oversaturated by too many low-quality products, too many shady or unplayable knockoffs being sold for too high of a price. By the time the first Nintendo console launched in America, the home gaming market was populated by devices that were steadily converging into PCs, and unlike them, the Nintendo Entertainment System didn't have a keyboard or a disk drive. It was marketed almost as a toy. Games were the only thing it did. Nothing more, nothing less. And it also differentiated itself by forcing third-party developers to meet a company-determined standard of quality. By regulating its product and by regulating its developers, Nintendo ended up beating out the Ataris and the Commodores of the day. Over the next few years, American game consoles would gradually become irrelevant, and the popularity of Nintendo's reached heights that theirs never did. But nowadays, those same philosophies that worked so well decades ago are kicking Nintendo right back. Last week, their stock prices plummeted after it came time for them to report on the poor performance of the Wii U. They're estimating a loss of $335 million for the year, after releasing earlier forecasts that expected a profit of $526 million. That's an $861 million difference between what they expected to make 2 weeks ago and what they're expecting now. Only 2.8 million Wii U's were sold this holiday season, compared to the 3 million Xbox Ones and the 4.2 million PS4s. This happened despite the 3DS having a stellar year of strong sales and many critically acclaimed games. But the 3DS's sales were also under expectations. They were expecting to sell 18 million, and ended up selling about 13 million, which, while not a bad number by itself, is still less than the expectations they were reporting to shareholders. What this means is that despite their handheld performing well, the Wii U is generating serious operating losses for the company. In response to the news, Nintendo's stock price dropped by about 15%, landing it at about 42% lower than what it was during 2009's highs. And it wasn't shareholders who were just panicking, customers were too. Within days of the news, rumors were already circulating about a next-gen Nintendo console called the Fusion. Rumors were also circulating about Nintendo releasing games or demos of games on smartphones, both of which were denied. Top company executives are also taking pay cuts to soften the blow, and this all led up to an investor conference that happened literally while I was writing this, in which Iwata explained that the company is not really going to change its general direction. They reiterated, again, that they're not going to be making smartphone games, and that they are going to further develop the Wii U's features, and that they are going to converge DS games onto it. They're also going to be investing in some kind of non-wearable, quality-of-life healthcare products, which sounds really weird until you think about how Brain Age, Wii Fit, and the cancelled Vitality sensor all fall into that category already. Anyways, what this news tells us is that Nintendo is in a real pickle right now, and they know it. And despite that, I kinda want to say that maybe we shouldn't be worrying so much. Nintendo's long-term style seems to tolerate close calls, risky ventures, experimentation, and failure more than the other two big companies. A lot of people are crying about how doomed Nintendo is, but this isn't the first or the second time that they've had to live with a lackluster product. But they did just come out of one console generation where they absolutely dominated the sales charts. People don't like to acknowledge that the Wii really did win the console wars last gen, but if sales volume is their measurement of success, then it totally did. And unlike the PS3 and the Xbox 360, the Wii was sold at a profit on launch, which means that Nintendo has a lot of money to screw around with. In fact, their stock prices were about this low during the comparatively stagnant N64 and GameCube years, but they were profiting back then. Last year was actually the first time in 30 years that they weren't. And that's the reason why this story is such big news. This is the second year they've faced a loss. I think I might have an irrational amount of faith in Nintendo because they've been making video games since before I was born. Hell, they've been making non-video games since before any of us were born, but keep in mind that nowadays this company has $15 billion to screw around with. They could afford to endure decades of the losses that they face this one year. Of course they shouldn't, and they most likely won't, but what that means is that Nintendo as a company isn't gonna go anywhere for a very long time. But Nintendo as we know it does seem to be ready to enter into a transformative period. While their history is peppered with failures, now is not a safe time for them to be failing. And if you look at sales figures for the 3DS, it doesn't seem like they should be failing. Its first year outpaced the DS itself, and its games regularly top the charts nowadays. The 3DS is doing fine, but the whole company is still losing hundreds of millions of dollars, and that means that there's something really, really wrong with the costs of the Wii U business. And for the record, I don't think that the problem has to do with what they're doing to their franchises. People love to hate on Nintendo and how it does business by cynically milking sequel after sequel out of their old franchises, but that's a strategy that prints them money. People apparently aren't tired of Pokemon, Zelda, and Mario since they won't stop buying millions of copies of them. And there's also a lot of resentment towards Nintendo's preferences to more kid-friendly games. And this is a callback to their older strategy of marketing the Nintendos as toys. Their games have classically been censored to maintain a family-friendly image, and that frustrates third parties. In fact, a source at EA has recently claimed that this is one of the reasons they stopped developing for the Wii U. But all of that apparently hasn't stopped Nintendo from dominating sales for about half of the entire history of console gaming itself. People don't like to acknowledge this stuff because it alienates the older and more hardcore gamers with their pretenses of maturity, but the cold, depressing reality of sales figures show that kid-friendly games are a recipe of success for Nintendo. Right now, the #1 selling game is Kirby on the 3DS, and who doesn't love Kirby? Even then, among the hardcore, it's difficult to find people who don't love classic kid-friendly Nintendo games, but people across pretty much any fanbase don't love kid-friendly hardware, and I think this is where the abstract, family-friendly image of Nintendo manifests itself into real, actual, concrete limitations. Everyone apparently likes the cutesy, lovable Animal Crossings and the Marios, and their sales data reflects that. But it's a lot harder to find fans of friend codes, fans of parental warnings, or online purchases that are tied to offline hardware rather than online accounts. And that is where the Wii U's real problems come into play. It doesn't have a target audience. It's not for the casual, family-based market of the Wii. That console sold very well for its time, but it was gimmicky. It ended up having a serious longevity problem, and Nintendo knew that. It developed the Wii U for the more hardcore crowd, but it didn't try hard enough for them. Outside of Nintendo, the bloodier and more online-focused multiplayer shooters are the recipe of success, and they tried to capitalize on this with the Wii U's launch lineup, and it didn't stick. It had Call of Duty, Deus Ex, Batman, and Zombie U, and those kinds of games don't come out for it anymore. EA has stopped supporting games on the Wii U entirely, citing difficult development and underpowered hardware, and they kinda have a point. Those kinds of games rely on the high-tech spectacle that underpowered hardware just can't provide. Meanwhile, the online features, which is another necessity for those shooters, hardly lived up to promises. Digital game purchases are tied to your hardware, and not your social account. Digital game purchases cost more than retail, and there's no official first-party headset for voice chat, and you can't use its built-in microphone for that either. So ironically, despite their best efforts to the contrary, the Wii U turned into a couch co-op machine for kid-friendly games that has a weird name and no target audience. Their problem lies in marketing this thing. They used the Wii to relish in the casual crowd, and they abandoned the casual crowd with the Wii U, while still keeping its same name, which confuses the casuals and alienates the hardcores. It goes against everything the Wii stood for, and it makes a bold step backwards towards the hardcore market, but it ended up satisfying neither crowd. And its sales are a real testament to how it has no one to market to. It actually sold more at launch than it did a year later. Even after a price cut and a few good games came out, less people wanted it, not more. The consoles that tend to stay on the market for a whole generation don't really work that way. Back in the 80s, a strict third-party certification process ensured that Nintendo games met a certain bar of quality. But ever since the PlayStation loosened up on certification, that now just means that most third parties pick other consoles first. Back in the 80s, Nintendo differentiated themselves by sticking to games only and marketing their products as a toy. And nowadays, that same philosophy has stigmatized their brand and stunted their console's features. And the weirdest thing is that despite all of that, the Wii U is something I actually want. I'm a big fan of a lot of the things they're doing with it. I love couch co-op, and I think it's an underserved market. I enjoy the lovable, cutesy Nintendo games. They're refreshing and fun. I really want to play Mario 3D World. I really want to play Wonderful 101 and Monster Hunter, and I sure as hell am gonna want to play Bayonetta 2, and my own lack of spending money is my own problem, but the Wii U's lack of a real system-selling killer app game and its perceived longevity is Nintendo's problem. It's up to them to fix it. Until then, all I can do is just be a small part of the statistics in their financial reports.